everyone is ready to begin, then I will start in 3, 2, 1. We negate resolve. The United States should establish a comprehensive bilateral trade agreement with the European Union. Bilateral 18 states, quote, the boundary between the rich and the poor, developed and impoverished, the oppressor and the oppressed, serves to deprive the vulnerable group from full access to mainstream resources. Marginalization within framework does not only allow us to focus on the vulnerability of individuals, but also allows us to bring into focus the personal needs, values, and priorities that are significant in the daily lives of marginalized individuals, end quote. We must not sacrifice marginalized communities for across-the-board gains that always benefits the oppressors first. Marginalized people and urgent issues in need of support should always take priority. Contention 1 is biological drugs. FDA defines biological drugs or biologics to include a wide range of products such as blood components, allergens, gene therapy, and are used to treat a variety of medical conditions for which no other treatments are available. Zellman 23 finds biologics treat cancer, psoriasis, arthritis, and Crohn's disease. FDA 20 finds life-sustaining insulin as a prime example of a biologic. Subpoint A. All trade agreements made by the U.S. require data exclusivity and intellectual property laws in pharmaceuticals. Palmetto 21 finds all U.S. trade agreements have required all party countries to enact intellectual property laws stronger than what's internationally required. Laws such as data exclusivity that give certain drug companies exclusive rights to their clinical data, allowing the sole company to sell their drug without competition. Palmetto 21 furthers that these rules are exploited by big monopoly power of big pharma, reducing innovation and harming those that rely on biologics. Subpoint B. A trade agreement will increase biologics prices. Kingman 23 finds data exclusivity enforced by U.S. trade agreements increased health costs in Colombia by $300 million. Malama 15 finds a U.S.-EU trade agreement will increase data exclusivity periods for new biological drugs, meaning cheaper versions won't be allowed on the market. Scheinberg 18 quantifies a trade agreement will increase biologics prices by 68%. The impact is health. The European Commission finds 30 million people suffer from diabetes. 20% of them require insulin to survive. They also find 28 million people have cancer, and Gold 21 finds 70% of cancer patients use biologics to receive treatment. Woodward 21 finds that even just a small increase in drug prices leads to a 33% increase in mortality. Contention 2 is small businesses. Subpoint A. A trade agreement only favors big businesses, leading to job loss and sidelining small businesses. CEO 19 explains that large corporations lobby to set the agenda for a U.S.-EU trade agreement. Year 16 states only big businesses are set to benefit, and SAP 24 finds the majority of U.S. small businesses stay in domestic markets. Dern finds that a trade deal will lead to the loss of 300,000 jobs in the U.S. and 600,000 jobs in the EU, due directly to the unfair import competition that small businesses will face. Contention 3 is Africa. Subpoint A. The current free trade system is corrupt. Wood 23 states the priorities of the great powers that built the free trade system are being wrongly swayed by domestic political demands, putting developing economies at risk. We saw this in the past, as Armstrong 15 finds the Australia-U.S. trade agreement resulted in a decrease in trade with developing countries, and the CTC 03 finds that Singapore-U.S. trade agreement established sweatshops in developing Indonesian countries for the benefit of Singapore at the expense of Indonesian workers. Subpoint B. The U.S.-EU trade agreement will harm African countries just the same. This happens in 2 ways. First, by growing the trade of large corporations that inherently prisons African countries. Urwago 22 finds restrictive trade policies from wealthy Western countries keep African countries chained to raw material exports. The EU places high tariffs on processed goods, but not on raw materials, bullying Africans to only exporting raw goods. European countries then process and re-export for greater profit, exploiting African farmers. The ILO 16 finds that 61 million children are pushed into child labor for raw materials. A trade agreement locks in this use of child labor in Africa to support European companies. The second is increasing market barriers for Africa. Rainfall 16 explains that the loser from the U.S.-EU trade agreement are developing countries. They experience dramatic losses in market share from intensified competition on the EU or U.S. markets. This problem is especially worse for Africa. Per capita income is estimated to decrease by 7%. Adam Tens finds this change to be dramatic. Whenever per capita income decreases by 1%, poverty rate increases by 2%. For the reasons of biological drug prices, small businesses in Africa, we are proud to negate to represent marginalized communities. Thank you.
Cool. For all my judges, 12-13, second on the pro side. Is anybody not ready for the speech to begin? Wonderful. Trade is never a guarantee. From geopolitical tensions, where Rosenberg of Rutgers in 2024 explains that trillions of dollars in Chinese investment threaten to replace the U.S. at the center of EU trade, to inconsistent politics, where Marcus of the Institute for Economics in 2022 continues that the future of U.S. trade can at any time be determined by the whims of Congress, now is not the time to rest on our laurels. We could be doing so much better, but the US and the EU just keep getting in their own way. The Studio of Politico in 2023 laments that in cycles of pettiness, what should be small differences in regulations continue to stall talks to trade agreements. It doesn't have to be like this. With the necessary protections in place, trade deals do work. From the US-Guatemala BTA, which created 1.8 million jobs and a 4% annual increase in GDP, to the US-Singapore BTA, which increased foreign investment by 9%, or the US-Australia BTA, which employed 150,000. In fact, analyzing the 11 biggest US trade deals to date, Bandari celebrates that FDI increased fivefold, with production, demand, and jobs all increasing. Enough is enough. To give a tried and true trade deal a chance, 1213 affirms, our sole argument concerns economic growth. While their economies have recovered from the pandemic recession, we aren't out of the woods just yet. Omar of Colombia in 2024 finds the high inflation is slowing certain sectors of the economy, with Chambliss in 2023 finding that GDP growth will fall 2.1%. And in Europe, Alan of Colombia in 2024 explains that economic stagnation has lasted for a year, with indicators of growth, quote, flashing red. A trade agreement gets us back on track. Between the US and the EU, most tariffs might be low, but in certain sectors like agriculture, prohibitively high tariffs are a barrier to growth. PhD economist Beckman finds that while the average tariff is 3.5%, tariffs in critical sectors like agriculture are a prohibitively high 30%. Reducing these tariffs is key. John Bacon in 2016 quantifies that a trade agreement would boost U.S. agriculture imports $300 million a year and exports $940 million a year. And while tariff reductions might get all the attention, the benefits go far beyond just that. As policy analyst Paul Hamill explains, 80% of the total gains of a trade deal come from more subtle barriers created by redundant regulations. These non-tariff barriers are a web of bureaucracy, as Dr. Burden finds that from nearly impossible U.S. laws requiring EU dairy producers to only get authorized by specific authorities, or to disparities in the definition of organic food, complying with overseas standards burdens exporters with unnecessary regulations. This political pettiness has snowballed. Kuhnhart of Brookings in 2022 continued, the FDA previously banned importing EU-based baby formula due to labeling disparities, contributing to a shortage in 2022, with regulatory hurdles overall burdening 60% of exports. The impact of reducing these barriers are twofold. First, the trade itself. By breaking down barriers, Hogan of The Economist in 2023 celebrates a deal would boost trade by 50%, contributing to specialization in efficient industries, and cause the Atlantic Council to find 740,000 jobs would go to the US and 400,000 to the EU. Moreover, getting rid of redundant regulations means cheaper goods. The US Congress explains that automakers have to perform very similar crash tests 2 different times to comply with both the US and the EU regulations, but standardizing tests would save consumers 7% per car. The second impact is the investment brought on by regulatory harmony. Because of unnecessary bureaucracy, which increases business costs, investors become wary of U.S. firms as Dr. Evnett analyzes 60 countries, 10,000 transactions, and finds that trade barriers deter investment. But without these barriers, investors would flock. As Liggett of the World Bank finds trade agreements boost investment by never be a guarantee go away, where we're more regulatorily harmonized.
Just a clarification, you don't have evidence saying that a US-EU trade agreement will lead to a 60% decrease, right? That's just saying
our evidence indicates that 60% of exports are burdened by them right now, and that we would create more regulatory harmony when we sign a trade deal because of things like economic pressure that force both sides to come to the table and turn a handshake agreement into a legally binding deal on paper. I'll take a question. Does your third argument on Africa contend that for developing countries, trade is a bad thing?
Not necessarily, just like with the United States and EU, when you increase that trade, you sideline Africa, right?
So that
Africa's
trade
not
specifically,
included in this deal.
So that trade specifically you contend is a bad thing?
Yeah, the trade agreement.
Okay, so isn't diverting trade away from these countries, as your argument suggests, a good thing? Because we've established that trade in this deal is bad for developing countries. Why isn't diversion then good?
No, that's not our argument. What we're saying is when you make trade between the US and EU easier, right? When Africa tries to compete in those same markets, they can't, because now they have to compete with US firms or EU firms, vice versa. And that leads to a 7% decrease in their annual incomes and pushes them towards raw materials, because now they can't compete.
So exactly, trade between the US and the EU is bad for developing countries. Diversion of that trade away from developing countries is a good thing. It's a counterfactual. Makes sense.
No, you're increasing trade though. Okay, can I take a
Your
question?
evidence says they get out-competed though, so how do you increase trade?
between the US and EU. That's the point. You're
Yeah.
increasing trade there, so then we don't trade as much with Africa, and that's what we've
So
seen in the past with Australia
trade-
and Singapore.
So trade decreases for developing countries?
No. Or yes,
Seem-
yeah.
So
Not
wait,
in the
so which
status
one
quo,
is it?
yes.
Okay, you
Yes.
can take a question, but we'll clear that up later.
Okay, so who decides what tariffs and non-barrier tariffs we get rid of, or non-tariff tariffs we get rid of?
It was the people who negotiate the deal.
Okay, thank you. You can take it.
Cool. Let us talk about your argument on drug prices. So right now, let's take insulin, one of the most jacked up priced drugs in the market. Is that drug affordable for your average American or European citizen?
For Europe, yes.
So you are saying, and you will defend, that the majority of European citizens can access life-saving insulin without any financial barriers.
If you look to the US compared to the EU, their prices are substantially lower
Yeah.
because they are lowering their data exclusivity laws. But when the United States wants to protect their big pharma companies, they force other countries in US trade agreements to adhere to their data exclusivity that's higher, so that they have a leverage over their markets, and that's what leads to a 68% increase in prices.
But it seems like
And that's
lower
time.
prices don't mean more access.
Okay. I'm gonna start perhaps now. I'm gonna stop. That was about 10 seconds, yes. Do you want me to send my rebuttal, Doc?
No, you're good.
We're gonna go our framework, their observation, down the process. Okay, are all my judges ready? Okay, let's begin in 3, 2, 1. Unequal rules for unequal players creates unequal consequences. If marginalized communities are exploited at the expense of economic gains in the long run, it's always going to be bad to vote for the pro side. Let's look on their first observation. They're going to tell you that free trade agreements are good and China is increasing foreign direct investment. We're going to tell you they don't give you a terminal impact of China increasing foreign investment because the fact is that the US is doing the exact same thing. But second, we're going to tell you to look to our case, where in Colombia, Jordan, and Chile, they saw an increase in drug prices as a result of adhering to US data exclusivity laws. Or look to the example they give you in case of US Singapore. They're going to argue that federal direct investment was a good thing, but when we tell you that resulted in the creation of sweatshops in Indonesia, that means marginalized communities were harmed as a result of this. Lastly, we're going to tell you look to NAFTA, where Scott 13 finds it cost the US nearly 700,000 jobs, and the US free trade agreement with South Korea resulted in the loss of more than 40,000 jobs. But now let's look onto this first contention about economic growth and inflation. My first response here is that tariffs aren't going to solve inflation. Kirsten 22 finds that tariffs have nothing to do with inflationary spikes. Tariffs had little effect on US prices. Eliminating tariffs would not significantly reduce inflation. At best, removing tariffs would result in a one-time price decrease of 0.2%, a drop in the bucket. Removing these tariffs would result in job loss and further destabilize US manufacturing. This is where we can look into their impact about cheaper goods. We're going to tell you if they don't solve for inflation, they don't move towards these cheaper goods. But on their sub-point B here, they're going to tell you that we have high tariffs on agriculture. We're going to tell you that if we move to a free trade agreement and we take away these tariffs on agriculture, it's going to harm European farmers. Sermondian 16 finds that because of a planned free trade agreement between the EU and USA, entire sectors of European agriculture could be endangered. No one can produce products like cereal as cheaply as the USA. European farmers are economically speaking outgunned. It would mean the almost automatic downfall of parts of the agricultural sector. The agreement strengthens the positions of large agri-food companies at the expense of small businesses. They conceded and crossed the people that set the negotiations are the ones that control what happens. We tell you in our case with Durden 16, big businesses control the negotiations, so in their world, big businesses are going to succeed at the expense of these European farmers. Let's look on this idea of non-tariff barriers. They're going to tell you that they're minimal things, such as things like dairy products and organic food, but we're going to tell you that non-tariff barriers are key to regulation. US 8 and 5 and 17 finds that non-tariff barriers include health and environmental regulations and mandatory product inspections. These measures help protect consumers and preserve the environment. So when we reduce non-tariff barriers, we'd see a backsliding in this progress, specifically when we look to the climate. The European proposals for TTIP would institutionalize a higher level of regulatory cooperation for the future, creating a mechanism to narrow the gap between European and American regulation. As the case of air travel regulation suggests, the likely outcome is to loosen the standards of greenhouse gas emissions to lowest common denominator. This is why Port Phil 15 finds that emissions would increase 11 million in the pro world. We're going to see harms in backsliding when we're looking at greenhouse gas emissions. But its third response here is it's not just in climate change, but also in small businesses. Kim and 19 highlights that large firms in the U.S. lobby extensively and outweigh and out-lobby domestic firms. International firms lobby to reduce trade barriers on highly specific products. It's the same warranting we gave you for agriculture. If big business controls the negotiations, they control the benefits, and that's where we're going to see this reduction in jobs. Let's look at their impact. They're going to give you the 740,000 increase in jobs. One, we're going to outweigh because we're going to lose 325,000 in the U.S. and 600,000 in the EU, which is over 900,000 jobs lost. But also, we're going to tell you any benefit to jobs is also going to be specifically to big business. But lastly, on foreign direct investment, we're going to tell you they only harm developing nations. Casido in 18 finds that foreign direct investments allow supply chains to expand by turning developing nations into supply depots. That's where when we look to Singapore, we're going to tell you that resulted in the creation of sweatshops. So you're not going to be voting for them if it comes at the expense of marginalized communities. That's where we fundamentally win.
Okay. Can I see the evidence about safety being reduced?
Yeah.
I said an email chain.
Oh, sorry.
No, you're good. You're good.
Is there anything else going on that, or just that?
It's just that.
Yeah, just that one.
When you get it, I'll prep.
That's good.
Or not my prep, but I'll prep.
Yeah. Great. We just got the evidence. Right.
Okay. Is anyone not ready? This is 12-13 for the pro. I'll start by defending my case and then attacking their case. The thesis of our argument is that growth in developed countries and developing countries is not mutually exclusive. We can have the best of both worlds. First, on developed countries, they say past historical free trade agreements resulted in job loss, but their evidence comes from A, 2013, and B, an author with the last name of Scott, whose article is titled, quote, "Job claims are pure baloney." It's not an academic article, whereas our evidence analyzed 11 of the largest bilateral trade agreements and indicates that investment increased and we had more jobs, which means our argument is historically right. Specifically, we say that a majority of the benefits come from reducing non-tariff barriers. So their response about tariffs not decreasing inflation doesn't actually address the root of our argument, because our evidence finds that 80% of the benefits comes from non-tariff barriers. They say that tariffs will harm European farmers, but this response is far too surface level, because European farmers do things like export livestock and vegetables, while American farmers primarily export soybean and grains, so they don't directly compete. In fact, we would contest this as a good thing, because both the European Union and the United States can have more exports or imports, decreasing the prices of food overall. They then say that things like safety would decrease, but A, their only empiric is about greenhouse gas emission protections decreasing. But our evidence, which postdates their evidence by 4 years, indicates that free trade can actually do things like reduce emissions, because less regulations allows companies to collaborate with one another more. Get this, for every 1% increase in trade, they find to reduce emissions per capita by 2.7%, which means safety is not harmed, but rather when regulations are aligned and we're on the same page, we see the benefits. Then they say that there's overall a net job loss, but the math does not make sense. They say we lose 600,000 jobs, but if we're creating 724,000 in the U.S. and 420,000 in the EU, then it is a net gain. Their last response is that FDI did bad things like create sweatshops in Singapore. But remember, our argument about increasing investment is not in the developing country. Specifically, it's in the developed countries where we already have labor regulations. Also, historically, whenever the U.S. has signed bilateral trade agreements, they've lobbied for stronger labor protections, which means it's not specific or a problem to our argument. Let's look at their case. The overall narrative of their problem is that things are already bad. Just go to local CVS or pharmacy. Drug prices are high. We have large monopolies, and on top of that, developing countries are dependent on raw materials. But the thesis of our argument is that we can actively make it better. On the argument about pharmacy, for example, our evidence finds that in 15 countries, a bilateral trade agreement either had no effect or actually decreases the price of pharmaceutical drugs. There's a few reasons why this happens. A, if data is more exclusive, then companies have more of an incentive to innovate, increasing the amount of patents by 44%. And there's more competition between EU generics and American products, which is why the overall prices of drugs likely decrease. They will just talk about how biologics are important, but we will contest that innovating new drugs is far better because plus or minus small decreases in prices don't equate to the magnitude of finding a new drug that can save a new type of cancer. But even if we account for the prices, our Grayson evidence actually analyzes life expectancy, the goals of medicines, and indicates that the socioeconomic benefits of a bilateral trade agreement increases life expectancies despite their argument. On their argument about small business, even if large businesses do lobby for the agreement, lobbying has happened in the United States for so long, yet so many good policies have been passed. Specifically for a bilateral trade agreement, we've had some that have benefited small businesses, like protections in the Mexico agreement. Moreover, a bilateral trade agreement can actually help small businesses by reducing compliance costs and regulations, which on net help them more, which is why 85% of small businesses said they like bilateral trade agreements. On their argument about developing nations, remember that these nations are already dependent on raw exports now, but our argument can solve for this because whenever trade decreases with developing countries because of trade diversion, it forces countries in Africa to look inward and towards countries in Africa so they lower tariffs there and can integrate more, allowing for domestic and local trade to increase, solving for the root cause of their argument. Moreover, our evidence finds that whenever the EU and US trade, the prices of goods decrease, so which allows the developing countries to get cheaper goods, thereby allowing them to generate more profits whenever they export so they can diversify to other sectors. And finally, when regulations are aligned, they can better participate in a global market, which is why our evidence finds that in the cases of South Korea, for example, trade diversion did not occur, but rather trade creation occurred. These reasons we're proud to affirm.
I see that 85% of small businesses said they like.
So this is the socioeconomic life expectancy.
I'll get that one.
Yeah.
Okay, the 85% evidence is set.
Okay, you ready?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so let's start off on this idea about emissions. You realize this evidence in an increase in trade reduces emissions. Is this evidence specific to a US-EU
Yeah,
trade agreement?
it specifically analyzes the impacts of an EU and US bilateral trade agreement and indicates that for every 1% increase in trade, which we contest will be a 50% increase, can actually reduce emissions per capita by 2.7%.
So
But I'm
what
glad
does
you
that
talked
come
about
out to?
evidence that is specific to the EU and the US, because I'm going to go ahead and take a question. Your impact evidence about 300 million people about diabetes. What does it say the impact of a US bilateral trade agreement would be on those people?
Yeah, so what we tell you is that we require this insulin to live. So if we tell you that
Wait,
as a
I'm
result
not
of
asking what
no,
you're
no,
saying.
no,
What does your evidence say about that?
That's just the specific impact. Our evidence that's looking at an EU-US free trade agreement comes above, where we
Okay.
tell you that all US-EU free trade agreements require data exclusivity. And when we look to what would happen in a pro world, that would mean that the EU would have to relate to US data exclusivity standards, which are 4 years higher than theirs are. That's where we see.
I get what you're saying, but can I ask a quick clarification?
Yeah.
So your evidence about the amount of people that are going to be impacted is not specific to EU-US bilateral trade agreement? Is that correct?
It is, because.
But you just told me it's the evidence above.
Can you let me explain?
Yeah, of
please?
course,
Okay,
of
so when you look at biologics specifically, if you require biological drugs to survive, they're important. So if an EU-US free trade agreement, which our evidence tells you specifically increases prices 68%, that's where you can weigh the impact, that's where you can
Wait,
weigh
can
the
I just
value.
like
Can I have a
one
question,
promise,
please?
quick follow-up, and then I promise you can get one.
Okay.
So just to clarify, none of your evidence specifically has an impact of EU bilateral trade
The
on
68% is
on
specific
life
to-
expectancy. I'm not asking about the prices of drugs because there are other factors that go into accessibility. I'm asking about life expectancy.
Mortality would be
So
what we
what
say
piece
then.
of evidence
Can I
is
have
an
a
EU?
question,
Yeah,
please?
sure.
Okay, when we look specifically to like this domestic trade and it forces these countries to trade with each other, when is that going to happen and when are they going to make back these
Yeah.
losses?
This piece of evidence is actually really good. It says it happened during the TTIP negotiations. Like whenever the EU and the US started negotiating with one another, African countries saw that they would lose their opportunity to trade with these developed countries, which is why they started looking inward and looking to trade with each other, actually lowering tariffs
That
between the
doesn't-
countries and solving for the
That
root
doesn't
cause
answer
of
my
resource
question.
dependency.
My question is, when is this going to happen?
As soon as the negotiations
So,
start. Remember,
as
I
soon-
said it happened when the TTIP occurred.
So So what's the quantification then? Because our quantification tells you, as soon as this happened, percentages go down
But
7.4%.
I promise you, your evidence does not say as soon as a bilateral trade agreement.
And yours does?
Yeah, okay. Our evidence is an empiric saying during the negotiations it happened, and the evidence is actually quite specific in saying that it would help like over 9 million people and raise
Okay.
incomes. I'm gonna go ahead and take questions.
Go for it.
Let's talk about the argument about small businesses.
Mhm.
Have we signed bilateral trade agreements before?
Yes.
And did big businesses lobby during those bilateral trade agreements?
We're gonna tell you two things.
Wait, that wasn't my question.
Wait,
I'm
going
asking,
to
did
answer
big
your question.
businesses lobby, yes or no?
I'd argue yes, and that's why we see
Okay,
job,
so they
job
did
losses in NAFTA, that evidence when conceded. That's why
Wait,
we saw
that's-
job losses in the US-Korea
Yeah.
agreement, that also when
All
conceded.
that evidence is from an unacademic article, and we have plenty more empirics saying jobs actually
You
increase.
didn't read it.
Here, y'all can take this stand. We forgot to get a key for control.
Thank you.
Ready?
We're gonna start running our prep time now. Wait, pause time.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing the cards about the 85% businesses in the front.
It's the very first piece of evidence I sent. I just click on the email. It's the first one.
Oh, I might not supply it all.
I did. I can make sure.
I see the Ben 16.
Yeah.
Yep, make it 16.
I can.
So
No, that's
the evidence,
the-
yeah, so the evidence about the small businesses is the TPP, it's the most recent email.
I can also just come over and show you if you'd like.
Okay. Resume.
Okay,
All right.
we have like,
I used a minute 30, so we have a minute 30 remaining. Just for
I used some time.
Did you?
Minute 15.
okay. Just as a quick off the cuff format for clarity, I'll be going over our framework, and I'll be going down the con side, and I'll be going down the pro side. Okay. With that, I'll begin. 3, 2, 1. They concede to our framework. We can't vote on the US and EU getting greater economic benefit when these marginalized communities will be immediately hurt to get there. The trade agreement is going to explicitly increase biologics prices, hurt African countries, and place small businesses under big biz. That's when you vote con. Don't vote for the 700,000 job gains. Remember, that goes to big biz at the expense of small biz. But on our first contention of pharma, they say we haven't seen drug prices increase in 15 agreements. But Kimun 23 finds prices have increased in Jordan, Korea, Guatemala, and Colombia by specifically over $300 billion because specifically of data exclusivity in U.S. trade agreements. As next, they try to say that patents improve, but when we have data exclusivity that's completely separate from patents, that stops other companies from getting patents, that shows you that in the pro world, they're going to increase biologics prices by 68%. Our warrant still holds true. They try to say bilateral trade agreements increase life expectancy. However, that's like on a broad, and that's like bilateral trade agreements as a whole. When we look specifically to the EU-US, Lemma 15 states that U.S. requires countries to enact greater data exclusivity that's going to decrease competition in Europe and lead to a 68% increase in biologics prices, which leads to a 33% increase in mortality. More people are going to die. But going on to our second contender of small biz, we're clearly winning here. They try to say there's protections in Mexico. No, there weren't. We tell you, NAFTA trade agreement led to 700,000 jobs lost. Specifically, Mexican small farmers were hit the most. We're putting small business under big business because they control the negotiations. They try to say 85% like BTAs. That's the trans-Pacific that's a trade agreement in the Pacific. That's not even related. But going on to contention 3, they try to say that Africa is going to look inward. That's not true at all. They don't have any evidence to support that up. Our link chain is clear. That making US-EU trade easier stops Africa's ability to participate in the same export markets, leading to a 7% decrease in average incomes, rise in poverty. And by empowering European large company exports, they're going to continue to exploit African people. Increasing trade for these large European countries mean perpetuating child labor. But going on to their case, we're clearly winning here. On econ, they first say that we're going to get rid of tariffs. Now they're saying we don't. They're not cohesive. A trade agreement will not decrease inflation. We tell you that, they don't respond. It would not decrease prices. Look to the fact they don't tell you once how much prices will decrease. They don't. So you have nothing to vote in. Getting rid of non-tariff barriers through a trade agreement is not as great as it sounds. They don't tell you what non-tariff barriers will be removed. But we tell you because big businesses lobby for trade negotiations, they control those. They control what barriers will be removed, so they get the profit. That reflects. They don't respond to that. In the past, trade agreements have resulted in the decrease of necessary labor and environmental regulations to benefit big businesses. It led to sweatshops in Indonesian countries for Singaporean benefit. They say free trade agreements reduces emissions and improves labor standards. They give this like 1% increase in trade. That's trade in general. Our specific evidence finds that a US-EU trade agreement specifically will increase emissions by 11 million tons each year because these provisions will be eliminated. So they don't prove how you help the economy. The economies are already doing well. They don't prove how much prices decreases. They're already decreasing in the status quo because inflation is going down. You only hurt workers and environment for big benefit of big businesses. This fits into our framework. At the end of the day, for marginalized communities, you're voting con.
Okay, we haven't taken any prep. We'll take our prep now. Let's go. Can I see the Jordan Korea prices improve?
For sure.
Thank you.
So Jordan is there, Guatemala, and then there is Guatemala. Okay, perfect. Like good thing, good. Sorry.
That was 2 minutes and 33 seconds. Are any of my judges not ready for the speech to begin? The order will start with their arguments on the con, and then I'll move to our arguments as a pro. So, con, pro. Is anyone not ready? Beautiful. Alright, cool. We contend that growth in developed and developing countries are not mutually exclusive, which is why we find their trade deal is the best way to solve their arguments. Conceding to their framework was intentional because the narrative we will present to you is that right now developing countries are facing high dependency, pigeonholed into only focusing on one raw resource, which is why poverty is going up on net. This will become clearer as they go to their specific arguments. On the argument about drugs, they have missed our specific warrant that innovation goes up because patent lengths decrease, which means that companies actually have to manufacture new drugs. Why does this matter? Their arguments apply to some existing drugs, but if we can innovate new research, new medications, we help people who otherwise wouldn't have gotten any help save their lives. That's why their evidence on prices going up is from 2006. Ours is a decade and a half later and finds that because of things like innovation and competition, 15 out of 17 countries, a lot more recently, saw prices stay the exact same or decrease, and the best way to break this clash is see that life expectancy went up on net. They just say that our evidence is only about the whole system, but there's no reason why it doesn't apply specifically here if innovation and competition went up in 15 different cases. The second argument about small businesses, the fact that 85% of small businesses owners want this trade deal to pass should be a reason why you sign your ballots for the pro. They said that our evidence is about the TPP. No, it's not. It's about the U.S. Small Business Survey about all trade agreements, which is why, for example, we say that things like lobbying go down to allow small business to gain more power and they gain more access to more markets, meaning more demand and 700,000 jobs created. The third argument about Africa, the place where you are signing your ballots is the regional ties argument. We say that when developing countries see the US and the EU negotiate on a trade deal because they don't want to lose out, they decrease their barriers with their other developing friends. That means there's more regional integration in the African region, which means that rather than taking developed country trade, which they contend is a bad thing, they're focusing on their own local partners, which means that a rising tide in this case does help everybody, which is why our arguments outweigh on scope, as our evidence indicates 50 million people could be lifted out of poverty and wages could go up 9%, a lot bigger case. But if that was true, we would have never signed beneficial things like the IRA, the CHIPS Act, because these small businesses are getting more power. The final argument they make is that emissions goes up. Our evidence post-stage theirs and finds that because things like competition, which free to make better climate change technology, and recently gaining power of small business who drive that innovation, emissions go down on net. Additionally, we say that because these businesses have harmonized regulations, investment goes up 50%, looking at 10,000 transactions and 60 countries, which is why 1.1 million people get a job. If their thesis is that a problem exists and that we shouldn't make it worse, that is fundamentally wrong, and you are voting pro.
Are you ready?
Yeah. Y'all can get first question.
Let's start on this idea of small businesses and launching a free trade agreement. What is the title of your article?
I'm sure you're about
What
to
is it
tell me.
looking at?
I'm sure you're about to tell me.
The Trans-Pacific
Yeah,
Free
yeah.
Trade Agreement.
Yeah,
not
that's why
the
you have to click on the article, right? Reading the title is not enough, and we have conceded warrants as to why small businesses are helped. For example, it decreases compliance costs, which are a fixed cost, so they largely affect small business more. Second, you gain access to newer markets, so small businesses have a larger customer base.
Also,
That's
really-
all good. Can I quick follow-up
Yeah.
question? That's all in good and well, but at the point where we tell you that specifically with an EU-US free trade agreement, small businesses aren't benefited, small businesses aren't at the negotiating table, so small businesses are the ones that lose their
Yeah,
jobs.
I think the difference between our arguments is that you're making more of an assertion while we are using reasoning that applies to this instance. For example,
Your
even
evidence
with the
isn't specific to this.
Yeah, that's why we've applied logical reasoning that would make sense in this case. For example, with the EU and US specifically, whenever compliance costs go down, because we're regulating and harmonizing standards between the two countries, small businesses in the US have to pay less fixed costs to their help. Second, and most importantly, small businesses in the US can now export to Europe, so our warrants still apply. But can we go ahead and take questions? Okay, are developing countries dependent on resources currently?
They're stuck on raw materials.
Okay, so just to clarify, in the status quo in your world, developing countries are stuck on raw materials. Is that
Free trade
correct?
system implemented by Europe, that would be worse than Poland.
Okay, that's perfect. Because our thesis is that things are bad right now. So at this point, your solution is to not make things worse, while ours is at least a chance to make things better, which is far more upside.
Wait, look at it to be.
Yeah, y'all can go ahead.
Okay, specifically when we're looking at this idea of like innovation and biologics, if data exclusivity prevents innovation, how are you going to say that you help people in the long run after you've conceded a data exclusivity warranty?
Okay, yeah. The thing about data exclusivity is mishandled because yes, if data is exclusive, then that gives companies more of an incentive to innovate because whenever they do unique clinical trials that have unique data,
Only one company can do that. That's where competition decreases.
Yeah, the
So
idea
it
that
takes
only
longer.
the idea that only one company can do drug innovation is blatantly wrong and ignores all the progress
No,
we
if
make.
you have
More
a
importantly,
patent,
really quickly,
you're the
let's analyze your evidence that makes this claim. It cites 3 examples from 2005. I personally was not born yet. A decade and a half later, our evidence analyzes 17 different trade agreements specifically with the EU and the
Yes.
US and finds that 15 out of 17 cases life
Yeah.
expectancy went up.
So it's more
To be clear, our evidence is from 2023. And
It's
says the free trade
analyzing
started in
2005
it
examples.
analyzes old data. So even if
it
you're
analyzes empirical free trade agreements.
yeah,
Yeah.
from 2006, ours is far more recent, but
So
also
what free trade agreements does yours analyze that are more recent?
things like South Korea. It's not about
When was
what.
that?
Wait, one second. It's not about when the free trade agreement was signed. It's about what years they are looking at, which is a unique difference thing. But second, we have read evidence that is specific to patents, saying the number of patents increased 44%, which is not something you've addressed with specific evidence towards the U.S. and the EU.
Okay. I think our
Just says patents and innovation. What is there? Patents. Also,
Okay. Is everybody ready?
Forget.
Overview of the reasons why we.
Oh wait, sorry. Before start, would you want this to end?
Not sure yet.
Yeah. Okay. I didn't want to interrupt, but.
Sure, thank you.
Let's begin in 3, 2, 1. They conceded that they didn't address our observation or framework. They said it was on purpose. But our framework tells you you can't help marginalized communities unless you center on them. The pro world doesn't center on marginalized communities. It's a rising tide narrative which helps the developed world to help the developing world. And that's the narrative that our framework despises. What we're going to see is the first voter into today's round is going to be the empirics. They're going to tell you that free trade agreements are good things, that free trade agreements have historically led to an increase in life expectancy. We're going to give you 3 warrants. First, they dropped our Scott 13 evidence, which tells you when we looked at NAFTA, we saw a decrease in jobs by 700,000 jobs. When we looked at US Korea, we saw a decrease in jobs by 40,000. When we look to these US EU free trade agreements specifically with developing countries, they dropped our examples with Chile, Colombia, and Jordan, which all tell you that when we implemented data exclusivity, their prices increased. They're going to tell you to prioritize the fact that there's going to be an increase in life expectancy. Their evidence doesn't say that an increase in life expectancy came as a result of this. We're going to tell you that when we look to data exclusivity, it prevents innovation, which is a prerequisite to all the benefits that they're going to say come from pharmaceuticals, and that comes from a long-term life expectancy. If more marginalized people have to die so that future people can live, that's a net harm to the status quo. But now let's look on the second voter about non-tariff barriers. They conceded since the beginning that the people who negotiate are the people that benefit. So when they concede during 16, that tells you big businesses negotiate current EU-US free trade agreements, they're the ones that are going to benefit. This is why when they read you evidence about the trans-Pacific negotiations, it's invalid in today's round because it doesn't look at who's setting the negotiating patterns. We tell you specifically when we're looking to small businesses, they're going to be pushed out 325,000 in the US, 600,000 in the EU. They're going to try and tell you that this outweighs. But we win when they fundamentally dropped our logic that big businesses are the only one that prosper. If big businesses have to prosper at the expense of 900,000 small businesses, again, that's a harm to marginalized communities that comes from long-term economic gains. On Africa, there's warranting here prefer quantification over everything else. If per capita income decreases 7% because the US and EU are trading more, that's a net harm. Rand Bill 16 is clear quantification. Poverty increases because of this. Marginalized communities are harmed. Vote.
Give me 35 seconds.
Okay. Is anyone not ready? I'll once again start by attacking my opponent's case, and then I'll go back to my case. So it's a con case and a pro case. And this is the last page for 1213 on the pro. Remember the narrative of their case. They have conceded that things are bad right now. Developing countries are dependent on raw materials and drug prices are high. So we ask you a question. When things are bad, what should you do? Should you sit aside and wait for them to get worse, or should you actively try to make them better, which is what the affirmative is doing? On their first argument about pharmaceutical prices, we have contested that drug prices will decrease because now European companies and American companies have to compete with one another, not about innovation, decreasing the prices of generic drugs as a whole. Even then on innovation, they have conceded that historically the amount of patents increased by 44% because you want the rights to the data, so there are more companies trying to innovate, which is why our evidence, which analyzes 15 countries instead of the 4 and is far more recent, indicates that the prices of drugs either A, stayed the same or decreased, and the only evidence to analyze life expectancy because of a bilateral trade agreement indicates that expectancy went up. Then on my opponent's argument, third argument about African and regional trade, they have conceded that whenever developed countries trade more with one another, countries in Africa look inward and lower tariffs with one another, increasing the amount of regional trade that happens, solving for the root cause of their argument by ensuring that they are no longer dependent on raw materials. They have conceded Armand's contextualization in summary that this will lift 50 million people out of poverty and increase incomes by 9%, which means we affect more people than they are, the only piece of weighing in the round. But we will say that a majority of these benefits do happen in developing countries, but that does not mean developed countries have to suffer. Even if developed countries don't see as much growth as developing, we will contest that we can help both sides. Our argument is simple. Free trade increases economic growth, specifically by reducing non-tariff barriers because 80% of the benefits that would come from things like duplicitous regulations, filing 2 papers for the same product, or inconsistent labeling standards, which when eliminated, increase investment by 50% and create 1.1 million jobs. Our opponents say that small businesses will be hurt by this, but this is not historically true. We have seen lobbying happen in the past, yet small businesses still prospered because things like compliance costs decrease and they gain new access to exports, which is why 85% of them like free trade. For these reasons, we are proud to affirm.
But the decision was ultimately a 4-1 for the pro side, Coach Walker.